Great. Okay, 30 students. Okay. Lynn, do you think we can start right now?
Yes, can we start now?
Yeah. We have more than 30 students, that's okay. You know, it's about 2/3 of the group. So that's supposed to be the quorum. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Good afternoon for me here in Paris. I hope you are doing well, and in spite of the difficult conditions, sanitary conditions, you are able to work and to study also. So the course we share together, it's the second course in financial analysis, if you like, which is a more advanced course than the preceding one. It's called Advanced Financial Policy and Diagnosis. It means it's the border between financial analysis, diagnosis, and financial policy. The goal at the end is to be able to make a diagnosis and to prepare a scenario or scenarios for a financial policy. We have 5 main topics in this course, and I'll show you the topic on the first line here. The first one will be an overview of the financial plan, which is a very central part here, and of investment decisions. You are experts now in investment decisions after the course. You studied with my colleague Olivier Grosard, and we integrate the financial part in the investment decision and discuss about investment decision on another where it means less calculation, but how to integrate the investment decision in a strategy, how to integrate them in financial policy, how to integrate them in the analysis. The second topic will be about financial analysis, how to use financial analysis to make a diagnosis, what is really very central, what are the main dimensions, how to calculate them. You know the criteria, you know the ratio calculation. It will be ready to discuss of the quality of this kind of analysis and the bias which are introduced by the measure we use. The third one is about financial resources and what they bring in terms of constraints and flexibility also. I mentioned here 2 or 3 topics among others. The first one is leasing, and this it's leasing because leasing is one of the hybrid techniques which can be used, but we could have done a few words on convertible bonds. What about multipliers and price earning? How to manage that and try to improve the financial resources using that kind of technique, and consequences. What are the consequences and what calculations? We'll come back to the topic here, which is the static approach, which is the one you studied in the course, and which is also presented in your textbook, Burke and DeMarzo, and the dynamic long-term optimization of the weighted average cost of capital. The point 4 will be mainly on equity issues, different categories of equity issues, dividend policies, impact on the equity issues, and also the other operation, which is share buybacks. And of course, we will integrate that with a few examples. The last one is about interest rates influence on leverage, on the diagnosis itself, and of course, on the financial policy architecture. And I will show you in a few minutes the architecture of financial policy. So that's the kind of questions we will deal with and doing this course. You know, if have a look, you know, to what we will do in this session, which is session 1. First, we go through the syllabus together, and you receive also the syllabus in the slides. And so some comments on the syllabus. Second, the exams, and the main constraints of the exam will be presented at the time we introduce the syllabus, but we'll go through also some other characteristics in the exams, and we'll show you 2 past exams from 2019, 2020, and you received this morning these 2 examples. I will come back on references and give you some more reading to go through in Burke and DeMarzo. Then in the financial planning architecture, which is one of the main points of this course, we will come back on a case you know very well, which is biotechnology, and it will be another introduction here, but you will have to go through scenarios on biotechnology later by yourself. And then we have a few points on the investment decision process and a discussion to go with more details and with other point of view than the point of view of a classical calculation, with mainly centered around the net present value. So this is what I want to say today on the structure of the session. And I will move immediately to the other set. I received 2 sets of slides. Okay, this one, which is called 93, that asks me when it is called 93. That's kind of mystery for me. But anyway, it's 93. And the other one, which is syllabus MEBF 18 FA2. And I will try to move on this one right now. I will hope it will work. It's this one. Okay. So I hope you see now my other slides. I have a set of slides. A set of slides including first the syllabus. After that, what I call the architecture, which is in a kind of tentative presentation here. We go further with other colors later, and you will get 2 different exams as examples of what you will have at the end of the course to go through, and also we use them for dealing with a few questions. So you get the syllabus, I hope. Should be there, yeah. I hope you can read it because it seems to be small, but you have a better, perhaps a better copy you received this morning. So what I'm interested in is not the first paragraph because you already know me, but it is only if you comments on the second paragraph here. The goal, of course, should develop students' financial skills and get them more familiar with diagnosis of financial statement of firm, their financial policies, and the valuation problems involved. It doesn't mean you will be an expert in valuation. We have another course, on company valuation in a few weeks. It aims at providing participants to develop advanced financial expertise. Students should be able to present a detailed and argued diagnosis of firm within the industry context based on comparative ratios, dynamic analysis, and financial models. Okay, so that's the learning objective. The capacity, to write a diagnosis, to make comparisons with other firms in the economic sector, to give also an opinion on the quality of the business model and the financial direction, CFO, in fact. The fact you are able to go through different scenarios on the future and to use basic models are part of the goals here. Point 3 here, it is a few elements, very short elements of the course content. We have 5 sessions, a system with the present system with online courses means 3 hours course 5 times, so we have 5 sessions. And 3 of them will be this week, today, tomorrow, August 31st, and September the 1st, which means Wednesday. We have a break, and after the break, you have last 2 sessions. We have, in fact, a long break, and we will be back together 2 weeks after. It means on September the 17th and September the 18th. Okay, so 5 sessions are divided into 2 groups, 3 sessions first, and after a break, 2 other sessions. That means you have time to read and to study by yourself between the 2 groups, subgroups of sessions. Point 4, of course, the main requirement is Burgundy model. You have 2 good chapters there. The first one you already know, and I hope you read this chapter for the last course on financial analysis, which is chapter 2. And there is a good chapter, which is a chapter which develop a models and valuation, but the main part of the chapter is not really on valuation, it's more on the design of scenarios. And the example is easy to read, it's well done, the tables are clear, the data also, so I encourage you to go through this chapter. It will be very useful for you right now, and also for the company evaluation course. I will come back in a few minutes on some more element on the Burgundy model. If you are familiar with other textbook, many students are also familiar with Breedemeyer's corporate finance. You have also 2 chapters which are dealing with the question I want to go through in that course, are chapter 19 and chapter 29. Okay. Now, if you are interested in going through exercises and look at the different calculations, you could go through Fraser and Remington, which is they are British, these are not American as well. Understanding financial statements, it's also with Pearson. Okay, and you find also the elements on that course, which are published by the CFA Institute. And this book is called Financial Reporting and Analysis. So you have variety of sources here. This is for me, so I will come back in a few minutes on Burke and DeMars. Now, for the exams, you have the two classical structure in this program and in my courses with an individual exam for 50% of the final grade and homework for 50% of the final grade. And I will send you specific emails and on that. It will be based on biotechnology, and I will send you more information on biotechnology, so you can go through the question raised. That's for the syllabus, okay? So now, if you have a look to the second slide here, you will see a structure which is a bit surprising, and including, in fact, two different parts. On the left side, you find the analysis of what is already existing, which is known. It means information dealing with the past and up to the present time, with main elements we will study right now: the investment selection process, the investment plan, consequences of a past debt decision, the financial plan itself, and the financial needs with the measure of the constraints which are done through financial analysis. Okay, we will study also, but it will be done later. This is the reason why there's no color at the moment. The income statement forecasts, which are based on the forecast of sales with two different hypotheses. This is what is supposed to be done here. This is the left side. On the right side, you find, the main elements of the scenarios and financial policy decisions. It means you are at that time you are here in the middle, between the two parts. You know the financial needs, all the financial resources. I never know what happened. You know the constraints in terms of liquidity and solvency, of course. In terms of debt capacity, you are supposed to be able to do that, and also of the different categories of returns. And that means that if you are able to find the criteria you want to meet, you can prepare financial scenarios, test the scenarios, choose a financial structure, integrate the financial structure and the new financial resources and constraints to the planning process, okay? And then have an analysis and a policy for short-term resources, which is cash management policy, and on the side, an analysis of the balance sheet, which means that at the end you are able to come back to financial analysis with an integration of the past and future. So this is the basic architecture. I will come back on the details and just you have a look at that point. What you will find here, and you see that slide, it's slide number 3. You have a final exam, which is on 3 and 4 and even 5. It's probably the version you have in terms of printing is much better, because it is. I sent you a Word version, and this is a PowerPoint version, and Word version are better in general. You have a structure. I will come back in a few minutes on the structure of this exam, and you have a second one here, which is an exam given 1 year after, exactly the same organization. Structure is nearly the same. Questions, of course, are different, you know, and we go through that and we come back at the explanations. Okay. So what I want to do is to come back in a few minutes, you know, on the. I will be back here. Huh? Don't worry about that. What I want to do is to come back on the other presentation. If I find it again, where is she? Is it 93? It's presentation 93. Okay. So you are supposed to see 93 now. I hope so. If you don't see 93 on your screen, just tell me you don't see it, because I have no way to check if it is on the screen or not. So I'm back on the first slide of the 93 presentation. Now on the second slide, I already said a few words on that, you know. So I went through the syllabus now, and before going further and coming back to the exams, I want to say a few more words on references. You have references mentioned in the syllabus, and you get your book, of course, kind of Bible of finance, you know, Berg and DeMarzo. And for Berg and DeMarzo, you find a few more references. Yeah, of course, you get the chapter 2. You already know, Introduction to Financial Statement Analysis. You are supposed to have good knowledge of this chapter. Second, I recommend you read also Capital Structure in a Perfect Market, which is chapter 14. I already said with the syllabus or in the syllabus, the comments, read also, and this will be useful for this course, will be useful also for the company valuation course, the chapter on valuation and financial modeling, which is chapter 19. If you want to understand what could be a debt policy, read chapter 24 on debt financing. And if you want to integrate, you know, all the specificities and constraints of the hybrid products, read the leasing chapter, which is chapter 25. So with all of these elements, you know, the slides, documents I sent you, the recommendations in terms of chapters to read, and if you want the other references like Bully Mario, so CF Institute, for example, you have enough documents, you know, to work. That's clear. Okay, so this is what I wanted to show you at that point. And before moving to financial planning architecture, excuse me, point 4 on that slide. I want to come back to point 2 on the exams, and to come back to point 2, I have to move again, you know, to the other set of slides. A set of slides which should be somewhere here. That's it, I think. I'm back here. And you should see here the syllabus again, okay? Then the architecture, okay? Then you have one of the past financial exams, final exams. And what I want to do, but you are now familiar with that, you know, and are supposed to be familiar with that anyway. I will send a few words on that. Is that for these exams, you have the condition which I mentioned somewhere. I'm difficult to find it here. If you have a part, it means you are not allowed this individual exam. You have constraints like on documents, computers, and mobile phones. Okay, and after that, it's organized around a structure with independent parts. It means in that case, for the June 2019 exam, we have 6 different and independent parts, which means there is no connection between them. They are completely independent, and you can start dealing with the exam and the questions as you like. I mean, if you are not very familiar with question part 1, don't spend your time or lose your time with this question and move immediately to part 2, to part 3. So it's very flexible, and be very flexible in the way you deal with the exam. My second advice, anyway, after flexibility, is to read. Read all the exams parts question before starting writing anything, and organize your time available, in order to maximize the quality of your answers. Now you will find, and it was the case in financial analysis exam, you will find 2 categories of parts, right? Those with questions, it means there is a question, you have to answer to the question. And this is here part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. And after that, you get here a part 5, which is an exercise, and a part 6, which is also an exercise. So you have here 2 exercises to go through. Okay, so you will find in the final exam, as you find here, 2 different categories of parts with questions to answer to, and parts with exercises. Okay. Now another point, and this is one of the reasons I say you read carefully your the exam before starting writing. In some cases, you have to answer to all the questions contained in a part, which is the case here. For example, for part 1, you have to answer to the 2 following questions. Also for part 2, also for part 3. Okay, but in some cases, and this is the case here for part 4, you will have to answer only to 1 of the 2 following questions. So when it is said written answer only to 1 of the 2 following questions, don't try to answer to the 2 questions. It's time lost anyway. I will read only 1 of them. Okay, read carefully and follow the instructions which are given in the exam. The questions with parts, with exercise have to be done from question 1 to question X. I mean, you cannot start in the middle. Okay, you have to start at the beginning. You need to move from one question to the next one, and because very often the results obtained in one question is needed to go through the calculations in the next questions. So there is no choice here. You will notice again, but that was true last time also in financial analysis, that will be true in company valuation also, that in this exam, I give you two more information. The first one is the number of points which are dedicated to the part. It means the total is equal to 20. But for example, here on part 1, it is for 3 points. On part 2, for 3 points. On part 3, it is also for 3 points. And on part 4, it is for 2 points. Okay. So some questions, are more important than others, I would say. And some parts are more important than others. Generally, exercises have a higher number of points than the other parts. And you find here that part 5 is for 5 points and part 6 is for 4 points. Okay. So we take that also into account in the allocation of energy, time to the different parts. I give you also another information, but which is a kind of element only for you to be better organized. It is the number of minutes I think you should allocate to each part. So I said here, first part is 20 minutes, second one is 20, third one is 20, but it's moving after that, it's only 15 for part 4, and it is longer for the other 2 parts, 20 minutes for part 6 and 25 for part 5. But, this is just my advice. You can do it whatever you want. You can spend 5 minutes on part 1 and 25 minutes here on part 2 and 30 minutes on part 3 if you like. At the end, anyway, you have to you have only 2 hours, no more, to go through the exams and the different parts. That's what I wanted to show you here. Now, at that point, I will come back to the architecture and to slide number 2 here. And the first point, here will be to try to integrate, what you have learned up to now. It means mainly financial analysis and investment decisions, and also structure and strategy. So this is the main goal here. And excuse me, this is what is circled in red. And this is what we are going to study right now. I will not deal today with the other parts of the architecture, and we bring them progressively into the courses and the diagnosis and scenarios of financial policies throughout the different sessions. Okay. So this is what I wanted to show you, where we come back anyway on this slide during this session today and during different other sessions. If you don't mind, I'm sorry for that, but let's move again to 93. So let's move together to 93. 93 is here. And you should have again here 93, which is Advanced Financial Policy and Diagnosis on the screen, followed by the content of session 1. We went through the syllabus, said a few words on the exam, more on references, on Burke and DeMarzo mainly. Have a look twice on the architecture of financial planning. And now we have two other points which are here: background biotechnology and the investment decision process. Okay. You know already biotechnology because you have been through financial analysis of biotechnology. And we will use biotechnology in order to develop, design scenarios of financial structure, financial policy, after making a detailed diagnosis, not only calculation, but a detailed diagnosis with proposals. Okay. Remember that in biotechnology, and some of you have already been through this element, we get into the case, an investment plan, a 5-year investment plan, which would be very useful for us. And if you consider this investment plan, you understand, that biotechnology is a growth company. You already know that the return for shareholder is very high, has been increasing regularly for years. You know also that the debt capacity is limited to 6,000, if you remember the data. You know also that it doesn't seem through the main calculations that we find any problem of liquidity and solvency. So it's a growth company which has been investing a large amount of cash in the preceding years, mainly brought by debt, and with a new investment plan, which is a kind of large investment plan. Okay. If you remember the total, it's about 150 million euros, and if you compare to the total level of the equity, it's more than 3 times the level of equity to be spent, with only 6,000 on debt capacity. So it was a growth company, it will be a growth company, a good return for shareholder, acceptable return on investment, no liquidity solvency problem. But we have a kind of optimistic strategy, okay, and with a high level of expenses. The group need cash, and you will have to find the scenarios, to find this new cash. You already have some data here. We're going to use some new and complementary data progressively. What do you know? What do you know? What do you know, in fact? You know that the shareholder group is very limited, in fact. You have one person, CEO, Mr. Vincent. He owns the majority of the company, majority of the shares, and there is a few members of staff which are also shareholders, and an investment fund. That's all. So you will have to convince them to bring some new resources, either in equity or in hybrid products. And this will allow the firm to obtain an increase in debt capacity and to come back to the market, to the banks, for obtaining new debt. I have a discussion also
Hoàng Quốc Việt theo yêu cầu của Ủy ban Nhân dân phường Cổ Nhuế, quận Bắc Từ Liêm.
We have a discussion on how to use leasing, which is also very essential. If you go to the appendix, you have 2 different appendix in the case. One of them is giving, so I would say, classical data when you go for financial policy and price earnings on the data company. And the second one, we comment that in details and show you some other kind of situations. The interest rate level and we discuss about which one to use when you make calculations integrating the risk-free rate. So this is what I want to say on biotechnology right now. When we come back several times on that case, you have already a copy on that case. You receive the copy. Read it again in order you know very well the case. You know, it will be easier for me to go through the presentation and easier to do as that, to go through the required calculations and questions. Now let's move to the main point here. And the main point is on investments, the investment decision process. A few slides, which are here, okay? On the investment decision process, I will go through in details on the investment decision process and comment these slides one after the other. And if again, you know, you move back to the architecture, yeah, that's it. You understand that everything here is based on the investment selection process. Yeah. I mean, if you want to go through a financial policy, if you want to integrate the diagnosis and financial policy, and even to write a clear and summarized diagnosis with recommendations, you have to analyze first the investment selection process and the investment plan. The future is in the investment plan. Future is not in the other elements. All the others are consequences of investment plan, which is in fact the financial translation of the strategy of development of a firm. So this is the reason why we have to talk again on the investment selection process, on the investment plan, before going further, and we have to take time to do this. So let's move back again to the 93 presentation, yeah, okay, and to slide number 4. To slide number 4, and in order, what is the organization of the approach? First, you need an investment decision, and you need to make kind of a calculation or valuation of the resources needed, not the kind of resources, but the amount of resources needed and the timing they are needed, its level of volumes and timing schedule of resources. After that, you will decide if it is equity, if it is free cash flow, if it is leasing, short-term, long-term debt, convertible bonds, whatever it is. So this is the main part. After that, but it is something which is coming later, and the flexibility in the decision process here is very, very limited. It is completely different from point number 1. This point number 2 is based, you know, on regulations, rules which are coming from the accounting rules, from the tax rules, you know, and of course it is useful. It is useful to calculate these amortization, depreciation tables, to design the income statement, and we need the income statement, of course, to calculate the different cash flows. 3, we need, and never forget that there is something which is very often forgotten, and this is very often as important in terms of monetary level, as point one investment decision, which is the debt repayment table, which means what are the repayments, not the interest. The interests are included in the income statement, but what are the cash to pay? What are also the resources needed to pay back the debts according to the debts contract? And you will get a specific table, which is also in your architecture. Then point 4, we go to the income statement forecast, because we need them for the cash flow calculations. And cash flow calculations, of course, are forecast. That means there is no certainty in that. And that's the reason why generally at that level, we start developing different kind of scenarios, optimistic, pessimistic, and so on, in order to understand what could be the range of cash flow values which are feasible. Then you will go to the central part. And the central part of this analysis here is the financial plan itself. And financial plan includes all the preceding elements. It is a kind of summary of all these elements, to make a kind of calculate a kind of proxy of the financial needs and of the resources available. Financial needs and resources available. Okay. And then point 6, in order to interpret the results you find in the financial plan, it means these financial resources or financial needs. Here, in that case of biotechnology, it would be mainly financial needs. You need a few elements of financial analysis. You don't need to go through a complete detailed financial analysis, but you need, to use financial analysis tools, ratios, in order to get an opinion on 3 main dimensions: solvency, liquidity analysis first, return for shareholders second, and debt capacity, which is here number 3 point. Okay, so that's what we want to do. But of course, you have to start by the beginning. And the beginning seems perhaps very simple for you, because you said a very good course with Olivier Grosard, understand what is an NPV, and I said what is an internal rate of return, some kind of payback periods, calculations, and so on. Great. It's very useful, But this is not the only thing. This is not the only thing you need. Okay. The first one, and I've been working for the Danone Group for years, and I was involved in kind of processes. The first thing you have to do is how to find new investment projects. What are the investment projects you really need? And it's not a question of data, of NPV, IRR, payback, or something like that. Because if you do that, if you say, okay, we will make calculation of NPV and choose, of course, the better, more important NPV, what's happened? What shows the experience? And you had good experience, which has been summarized by consultants with the professional papers, or also in academic journals. It is that your first choice is to replace your present investment or equipment by the new version, the improved equipment, but the same kind of equipment. And you have to open the windows. Open the windows. And this is what I say here on point number 2, on point number 1, line 2. We need to integrate innovation, not only, in fact, modernization. And innovation could be in the process for producing the same kind of product at the end, but it could be also to integrate innovation to modify the product and do something which is completely different. And, it can be discontinuity there with a need for a new kind of innovation. Innovation has to be integrated. So the first step you have to go through, it's a process, an organization in order to catch the potential innovations in your investment portfolio. It is innovation versus modernization, the trend, the security for each one of the firm. It's okay. We are going to modernize, to do the same thing, but more efficiently, improving the productivity and so on. But innovation is generally not taken into account. So you have to find the kind of solution, to of organization which integrate innovation. That means no data, no calculation. A step, the first part of a process which will be organized in order to catch the innovation. What does it mean? It means we have to be long term. And, if you don't organize this process, the decision made will be short term, and short term could be in 3-4 years. In the food industry, it is 3-4 years. In some other industries, like the steel or like the cement, it could be 7, 8, 9 years, but no more. And the question is not really there. Each time you go through investment decisions, you have to start again. And for example, in the food industry, I know very well, the question is, do you think that the inhabitants in this world will still eat same kind of dairy products like yogurt in 2030 or 35? No? If you think they will still eat yogurt, perhaps you have to modernize your process, improve the taste, the security, and so on. But if you think that it's not so sure and that other dairy products could be proposed, or that the taste of the consumer will move from dairy products to other kind of products, you have to integrate that and to design a new kind of investment which is needed. So it is long term, and it should integrate creativity. Creativity is one of the main elements of the preparation of the investment plan and the financial plan, and it has to be organized. This creativity step has to be organized through working groups of different categories of staff with different expertise in order to catch the best idea. And it is also, it's not a top-down process, not a top-down process. All the decisions, which are top-down are generally not the best decision. It has to be organized through a process integrating all the members of the staff, whatever they are, whatever is their level in the organization. It's done top. It's starting from the factories, from the sales teams, and so on, and progressively, it is integrated in a process moving to the top decision makers. So it's not top down; it's down top. It's very difficult in many firms to have this process organized because of tradition nearly everywhere in many cultures and are top-down decisions of processes. But this is what we need. It doesn't mean also that experts and consultants, are not integrated into the process because they bring also some kind of specific expertise. For example, we know that the tastes of consumers are moving and are moving independently of the choices of a firm in the food industry. That means, and I give you the example here for in point 2, first line, we had this problem, with the sparkling water. If you had a look to what's happened, in the 80s of the last century, which is not so right, it's about 35 years ago. It was very difficult in Europe to sell good condition, good price, good margin sparkling water. It was not, the taste of the consumer at that time. But if you go back into history, and we have very good, analysis of the history of the tastes of the consumers. If you go back before the First World War, you understand, that consumers who were looking for salty springs. A good example, we probably don't know this brand, it's Vichy. Vichy was the first, water offered, drunk, proposed in the mills, during the mills in France and in Germany at the time. Progressively to more neutral water, and went back progressively to sparkling water with neutral temps, without salt, starting in the 80s and 90s of the last century. And today, consumers are looking for neutral tastes, But when you integrate that kind of expert, they say, okay, it's a cyclical movement. And if you want to buy a spring, for example, and to develop the spring production around the brands and so on, you have better to go back to salty springs because the prices are very low today, because no one really is interested in that. But it seems, according to the history and the cycle in taste, when in about 30, 35 years from now, the demand for salty spring will be very high in Europe. So you have to integrate this data, this analysis coming from experts, in your process. And of course, when you calculate, if you want to calculate an investment in a salty spring today, and you go through your NPV calculations and so on, you will be very disappointed because whatever, with free cash flow, you estimate for 2050 or 55, you will find negative net present value. And this you will say it's not a good investment. But if you want to have, high market share in 2055, you need to invest in these salty water springs. That means you understand that, in fact, what we know on net present value show that net present values are criteria for short or medium term. But if you want to make the investment which will make your firm survive or being still or becoming a leader 30 years from now, you need to take into account other criteria. Net present value is not the correct criteria. So this is the first thing you have to integrate. This is very difficult to explain to in firms, because Generally, you know, executives they like data, formulas, calculations, you know. Of course, you need that, no? But it is, you know, a second step. The first step, the most important one, is not there. It's a process of integrating innovation, integrating, you know, new ideas, creativity, and being involved into the strategy of a company. Yeah. We have another example, you know, with Danan, which is the story in Japan. You know, the group has a subsidiary in Japan, and is selling in Japan today at the same time water, bottles of water, and dairy products. But if you go back to the history, you know, and I was been giving that, it started by the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, you know, and the CEO of Danone at that time thought he had a very good idea, which was to be invested in Japan, because Japan was a very powerful economy. It was the second one in the world at the time, you know. And he found a partner in Japan, and they created a joint venture, wanted to create a joint venture. And this partner, you know, had a supermarket network, and of course was able to develop dairy products. And dairy products was not, there was no dairy products tradition in Japan, and the capacity to produce and the knowledge of the products was quite limited if you compare to some European countries, in particular to France. And decided that the good way was to make a joint venture, you know, with distributions network and the capacity and to produce. So we decided to do that. And when the project was analyzed in Paris by the teams in marketing and in finance, in marketing they thought that it is a good idea, but the future was there, and that progressively, you know, with the diversification of the demand for food from the Japanese consumer, dairy products market will grow. And on the other side, of course, the financial team in Paris made the calculations using the classical criteria, you know, and they said, whatever happened, we will never have a positive NPV, so it's not a good investment. You have a look today at what's happened. You know, we are in 2021 right now, and you raise the questions to the CFO of Danone, saying the group is now invested in this country, in Japan, and it started investing nearly 32 years ago. Do you think it was a good investment? What do you think is the answer of the present CFO? He said, let's have a look to the data. And when he has a look and show you the data, it appears that the subsidiary in Japan is number 2 today in terms of return, and has been number 2 for the last 3-4 years already. But of course, if you calculate the NPV starting in 1990, with about 10 or 11 years of losses for the 10 first years, the NPV is negative. And of course, because NPV, you know, overvalue the first years because of discount rate. So I would say to the CFO, it's not a good investment, you know, because your NPV is negative. He says, I don't care about that. You know, I was nominated 5 years ago, and for the last 4 years, I'm one of the best results of all the subsidiaries of the group abroad. I don't care about what's happened in 1995 or 2000. You know, it's far. It was another generation, another world. So that means you have to be very careful when we talk about investments, you know, because our criteria, which are very useful, of course, I don't say not that, but you have to be conscious, you have to understand that an investment policy is not only a short and medium-term policy, but it's also a long-term policy, integrating innovation, creativity, you know, in the situation in a long-term period. And this is very important. So that means when you want to organize your process of investment decisions, you have to do it in different steps. Number one is to identify potential projects using more creativity, exploring the innovation you heard of, and and you should ignore the data analysis of calculations, and of course the formula and the classical investment criteria. Second, of course, after that, the choice has to be done. And in that kind of analysis, the choices of the list of potential choices of investment has to be brought up through the hierarchical structure from down to up, where the decision will be made. And then a process of data collection, calculation, ranking will be organized. So when you go through financial planning, you have to take into account these two dimensions. That's very clear. For example, another example today, which is another kind of economic sector. And this is here also on my slide on point 2, cases. You see cases point 2, line 3. You find air liquid hydrogen engines. You know, this is also up to date. You know, we have many projects in the world integrating this new source of energy, particularly for trains, boats, buses, lorries, and so on. But if you have a look at the calculations today, you know, it is clear that it is still negative. It's much better to run a bus, for example, with a classical diesel petroleum-based engine than by an hydrogen engine. But if you have a look to what the situation could be or will be in 10 years, 15 years from now, you cannot ignore that kind of investment, of technological change, probably a regulation change also, which is behind. Yeah. So if you decide in terms of NPV, the decision will be negative. If you have another vision, longer term vision, you decide to invest in the hydrogen engines, refueling system, and so on. And the company Liquid is number one in the gas industry in the world today. They have developed for the last few years high investments, different kind of investment in hydrogen engines, you know, in order to be there, because they believe that it will be successful and that in the long run, even if they are not able to make any kind of calculations, you know, this kind of engine will be leading, at least for some kind of mobile, like the buses, the lorries, the boats, perhaps the planes also. So after all these elements have been taken into account, a portfolio of selected projects is identified. And it is generally a mix for companies growing. And remember that biotechnology is a growing company. It's a mix of selected projects of innovative and of modernization projects, because at the same time you need, of course, the cash flows coming from and the positive NPV coming from more standard projects which has been improved progressively, being more efficient, being more productive, being less costly, you need these cash flows in order, to finance the new investment projects, which will be sometime the best ones, but in the short term or medium term even, are costly and with negative and net present value. That means, again, you cannot ignore when you make investment choices, you cannot ignore the fact that you need an equilibrium, which is a kind of matrix you find in strategy, with BCG, right? Which means you need maturity investment, cows, as we say in strategy, bringing cash flows to finance the future projects in the short term with negative NPV, but in the long term, which will be the new cows of a firm. So be very careful on not issue classical finance and what you learn in the courses and what you find in the seminars is very conservative, is very short term, and life is not only to improve management quality of a short term, but also to survive in the long term and to find, areas, fields, projects which are with good returns in the long term. Next one, in the investment decision process, are dealing with the list of criteria you find here. When you have a list of projects, bringing innovation and bringing modernization, you have to analyze these projects, according to different dimensions. And the first one is a very classical one, and you know that very well, which is the what we can call the liquidity solvency analysis, and which is made according to what you learned in investment decisions through two criteria, which was what we call the payback calculation and the payoff calculation. Have two criteria which can be used. It means how many years, are necessary. How many years are necessary to have our cash back? Is a cash back analysis. We invest cash in a project, whatever it is. How many years after do we have this cash back? So this is a question which is very central in the analysis, because there's being a constraint on the financial structure of the firm. If you have projects with short payback periods, it means it's not necessary, for example, to have too high level of equity and also to have long maturity debt. You can finance with a limited level of
Excuse me, Professor.
Equity and also short and medium-term debt. Okay, so there is an impact on the payback calculations and the structure of the firms. It is clear that you don't finance the same way a dairy product factory and a steel factory. Payback period is not the same. It's about 3 years in one case, it's about 9 in the other one. So this investment choice has a great impact on your financial structure. So you use one first criteria or second one, as you prefer. It doesn't really matter. When you make the calculations by both criteria, perhaps you did that. I understand that they are very parallel in terms of the results, And so the second point is on the payback limit horizon. I said just a few words on that. It's much more simple to finance a food company than the cement and steel industry. You will see that in one of the following courses where I present you the example of S Group, Danone, which has been moving from the glass industry. It was at the beginning, when it was created in 4 years, it was a glass producer for buildings, glass production for car industry, glass production also for the producer of beer, for example, bottles of beer. And they moved progressively to the food industry. And this change gave them great opportunities, in financial policy. Because of course they needed less equity, they needed less long maturity debt, it was less costly, it was also less risky, they were more flexible. It is clear that these differences between economic sectors, have strong consequences, on the financial portfolio of financial resources, on the balance sheet structure also. And there's these choices, which are completely linked, investment decisions and financial structure are prepared by the CFO, but at the end, it is a very strategic decision, and the final decision is made by the CEO. So I give you the example of the point 3 here, strategic investment decision in Japan.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yeah.
Yes, could you please switch the file because we're still in the syllabus file. Thank you. Can you switch to another?
You had to tell me that before.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyway. Curious. What's happened now?
Yes, it's okay. Thank you,
It's
Professor.
okay now. It's investment decision 2. Point 1 is liquidity solvency. Point 2 and okay. Sorry for that. But when it happens, it can happen. I'm sorry for that. Just tell immediately that there is something wrong. Okay, thank you. Anyway, so what I was dealing with was point 3 here. I already sent a few, brought a few elements on point 3, but there's a second one here, which is Danone decision to disinvest from the beer industry. I said that Danone was first a glass producer, flat glass, but also what we call packaging, bottles mainly, bottles of water, bottles of beer mainly today. And the beer industry was, and is still, very profitable industry, high returns. High returns for shareholder, high returns for the company. And when you are in the food industry, you understand that generally, it is your best return and your best producer, source of production of cash flows. You produce more cash flow with one monetary unit of sales in the beer industry than in dairy products, or in the water supply, or in the biscuit industry, for example. Right. So what does it mean? It means that, of course, in a firm, when you ask to the CFO, to financial team, what they think, they said, "Oh, we have to develop the beer industry because you want to make new investment, and it's easy to finance because we have excess cash flows coming from the beer industry, and we can buy firms or invest in new categories of products and so on." But if you ask to the marketing, team, generally they say today, we should sell the beer industry because it's not in line at all with the demand for the consumer and citizens of products which are in line with health, sport, leisure behavior. And the argument is that in the long run, even if you have high cash flow today, it will be very negative on the reputation of the company. And we have consequences, negative consequences on the value of the firm on the market, but also on the agreement of shareholders and lenders to bring new resources to the firm. That means you have a portfolio of activity with very high return, constant, recurrent, growing, and you have a marketing team saying, no, it's not a good strategy. You have better, to produce dairy products, because dairy products, are better for the health. And this is also taking into account the public opinion today, integrating this criteria. And this will have, if you increase your investment in dairy product and reduce your investment in the beer industry, or sell your beer activity, it will be a good message, positive message, sent to the shareholders, to the markets, to the lenders, and this will, in the long term, create value and facilitate your demand, the success of your demand of new financial resources. So, it means that it is very complex to make a decision. And we have known that in the Danone Group, which was number 2 in Europe for the beer industry 20 years ago. And progressively, we decided to move out of the beer industry for that reason, in spite of the fact the cash flow produced per unit of sales were much higher than in any kind of segment of the food industry. So, reputation, long-term, availability of financial resources, behavior of shareholders and lenders, all these elements have to be taken into account into investment decision and the structure of an investment portfolio. So, in fact, when you do that, you reduce your investment portfolio generally, at least in the first step, before perhaps finding new ways to develop segments which are in line with a new policy of communication, health, and so on. So this was point 3 and 2. Now I'm here on point 3. Yeah, this is slide number 6. Yeah. Slide number 7. Yeah, this one. A few more points on these dimensions also here. we have to be very careful too. The first one is about the calculation of NPV. The first problem we have, is with discount rate. When you study that with Olivier Gozard, that was the goal. The hypothesis was that we discounted cash flows with using the weighted average cost of capital. But after that, discussion is about this weighted average cost of capital. And the idea, of course, was to say, okay, if we need the highest potential NPV, we need to minimize the weighted average cost of capital. Minimize. Because if you increase your weighted average cost of capital with the same cash flows, you decrease net present value and the return of investment portfolio. Okay. But what does it mean when you say we have to minimize the weighted average cost of capital? What is it? It means weighted average cost of capital is generally weighted average of equity and debts. And what we know is, of course, that the average cost of debt is always lower than the cost of equity, just because of risk. Level of risk is different for the lenders and for the shareholders. But if you want to minimize, your weighted average cost of capital, you have better to increase your level of debt, at least as long as the interest rate doesn't increase. That means, this approach of return means companies, firms should have a relatively high debt level. They have to be financed by a large part of debt. And if you decide to increase, of course, your level of equity, you have a cost of the resources, portfolio of resources. It means a weighted average cost of capital, which is higher. And your NPV are decreasing. Your returns, whatever they are decreasing. The profitability of the firm is decreasing. So we understand that there is somewhere a balance between risk, the higher the debt, the higher the risk. The weighted average cost of capital, the higher the debt, the lower the weighted average cost of capital and the higher the profitability of the portfolio. And also the future developments. Because of course, if you want to, in a few months or in a few years, go through new investments, you need financial resources to finance these investments. And we know that the easiest way is to have a debt capacity. But to have that capacity, we need to have, before that, the present time, a low level of debt. And if you have a low level of debt, you have a relatively high weighted average cost of capital. So, more clearly, perhaps, that to size opportunities of new investment of acquisition in the future, it's much better to keep a debt capacity, but to keep a debt capacity needs to accept a WACC which is not which is lower, but can be done. And what you find in the presentation of investment decision is that it is in fact, a kind of static approach. It means only present elements, certain elements today are taken into account. But in fact, if you go through studies on investment policy of firms and to interviews of experienced CFOs, they would say, we have to integrate the future, not only the present information, but past and present information. It means we need, to explore the potential opportunities of future investment or future acquisitions. And we have to be ready one way or another to finance them. And to be able to do that, it's much easier, as we know, to have a debt capacity and to organize this debt capacity in contract, generally options, signed with banks. So what we understand, is that the NPV approach creates a bias because it is too short term. And that if you want to integrate not only what will happen on the market in 20 years from now, but also in the next few years on your investment or acquisitions, you have to keep a debt capacity and to accept some kind of overvaluation of your WACC and the undervaluation of your NPV and your return. So this is a very central question in financial plan establishment, okay? And this could be managed. We have tools to do that today, mainly around portfolios, of course, of options, but the calculations on included into the diagnosis and the financial policies can be limited only to the integration into the calculation of the past and present data. The second point here is that it is difficult to go through the calculation of NPV or calculations also of price per share. We come back on that using dividend policies because they suppose, an integration or calculation or forecast of future NPVs and dividends on the very long term. I mean, if you want to calculate the value of a firm, you can say, okay, it is the value of a portfolio of investments on a very, very long term, infinity. Okay. Well, what does it mean? You know that some investment will not be useful anymore to anyone. You know also that in terms of basic calculations, you are not able to go through the income statement forecast in 25 years from now. So you need to have some kind of calculation of integrating the future, generally, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. And after that, to calculate the kind of terminal value, which has to be integrated into the NPV calculation. And terminal value, it's a bit difficult to estimate. So I want at that point to go through that questions. At the time, we have a company valuation course, but be very careful. We have not only the discount rate problem, we have also the terminal value problem, which is very central. Because it's very nice to write these formulas, with cash flows or dividends, on a very long period of time, but it doesn't work like that. You cannot work like that for a basic question of impossibility to estimate the data to take into account. The third problem, which has to be analyzed in this return analysis, is a problem of the operating working capital. If you remember in your calculation you went through, very often they are not taken into account because they are not, they are not connected in the mind of those making calculations to reinvestment level. But in fact, in most of the cases, when you buy a production equipment, to come back to something simple, you need also to create, inventories in raw materials, inventories in intermediate products, intermediates in final products, just to have a kind of continuity of the production process, and also to be able to satisfy in the very short term the demand of the customers. You need also to adapt, to the tradition, the economic sector, which is, for example, to give a 30 days or 50-day credit to the customers, and that would be an increase in receivable, which is part of the calculations in the operating working capital. But on the other side, you get resources also coming from free main resources we know, which are, remember that, which are the debt to the providers, which are the debt to the staff, and which are the debt to the tax administration. And this operating working capital is generally increasing when you increase the size of investments and you increase your level of sales issued from this investment. This has to be taken into account into the calculations of net present values. So this is the last point on this point number one. We have another approach also, which is more simple on the NPV, which is what we call the profitability index. And this is another question you have to go through when you make all these calculations. NPV calculations are, I would say, absolute calculations. It means NPV doesn't integrate the size of investment. You are in favor, you rank number one, the investment with the highest NPV. But what does it mean? It means we are not limited. There is no limit in terms of financial resources available to finance the investment. That could be the case in some specific industries or in some specific period of the growth. But generally, you have constraints on the financial resources. I remember at the time in France, we said it was in the 70s, it's about 45 years ago. It was said after the different crises in the oil market, we don't want to be so dependent from the oil production. And we need to produce electricity. That was already the question. Using another resource. And it was decided to develop nuclear plants. And at the time, of course, it was said by the state, there is no limit in terms of financial resources. We will invest from private or public financial resources what is needed to develop this nuclear plant program as soon as possible, as quick as possible. And this is the classical situation where NPV is useful. We were looking for the highest level of production, higher NPV, whatever was the amount of financial resources needed. It means in the allocation process at the level of the country, of producer of electricity, the priority was so great, but it was decided, to eliminate all the classical constraints in terms of allocation of financial resources. But generally, it's not the case. All firms, have limits. They are constrained. you know, they cannot find the financial resources they want without any limit. In some cases also, you find banks and financial markets which are required by the Ministry of Finance or the central banks mainly to reduce the liquidity level they bring to the investors, just because we are in a period of time we are fighting against inflation, for example. So generally we have constraints. Sometimes they are very tight, sometimes they are less tight, but we have constraints. That means it's much more interesting to have a return, to measure a return per monetary unit invested than an absolute return. It's much more interesting to be in that kind of situation. Okay, so we have progressively, defined a new criteria, which is not the absolute NPV, the one you have studied with Olivier Gozard and you find in the Werken des Marzo book, but the NPV per monetary unit. So you divide, the NPV by the level of the resources needed for investment, by the level, total level of cash needed, level of investment itself, and you find a percentage. Instead of finding NPV, which is a million of whatever you want, dollars, euros, you find a percentage. Okay? It's not an absolute criteria, it's more relative, to the allocation of funds. And that is also much more interesting because now you can compare. If I get 15% for the PI, as it is called here, 0.2, okay, what does it mean 15%, 1.5? Two digits, that's good. There's no meaning. You can immediately compare, which is not the case with an NPV, to references to benchmarks. And what could be your references to the benchmarks? Yeah. The first one is, of course, inflation. When you have a profitability index which is less than inflation, it means that you are losing money. Right? It's not a positive return, it is a negative return. If you have an inflation which is 10%, you have a PI which is 15. That means your real return is 15 minus 10, which is 5%. If inflation rate is 20%, it means it is negative, 5% negative, and you are losing money. Your return is negative. So this is the first criteria. The second one, what is the second one? Let's remember you are generally in limited, you are limited by constraints in terms of level of liquidity available, and perhaps you get 15%, perhaps inflation is 10. Okay. If you have a look to this investment alone, say it's good. But now, if you have another opportunity of investment with 18%, and you don't have, the necessary resources to finance both of them, and of course, if the risk level, don't forget that the risk level is the same, you will consider that your 15% PI is not the PI of a good investment. You have to invest your resources in an investment, perhaps the 18% one, with a higher PI. So the profitability index, a low comparison with inflation, with interest rate, with other references of comparable investment with the same risk level. So in terms of analysis, in terms of scenario design, it's much more useful than the net present value. Now, this is the first element, you know very well also, which are the internal rate of return, what we can call IRR. They are easier to calculate in large majority of the cases than the NPV, okay? But after that, you have specific cases, and if you remember, perhaps we went through exercises with Olivier Gozard, that, you know, if you have a series of cash flow with alternative, negative, and positive signs, you will get several internal rate of return. That means the criteria, you know, is easy to use when you have only positive cash flow after making an investment. If you have, for different reasons, you know, either a few years with negative cash flows, or, you know, some years because the market is very volatile, negative and cash flows, and after that positive cash flows, the criteria is very difficult to use. You have some possibilities to use it, but it's much more complicated than the other one. So that means when you consider, you know, the possibility to use this criteria, you take into account constraints. You took into account the calculation bias. You took into account the formula of IRR. Your conclusion is easy. What do we have? We have two criteria, which are expressing, you know, the elements of strategy, including the elements of strategy refer, which are a payback period first, and the second one is a profitability index. So if you come back to Berg and DeMarzo, to some other authors, you will understand that this is not their decision, their recommendation. They say for scientific reasons, the only good criteria is the NPV. Of course, they are right. If you do scientific criteria, scientific approach, but if you become more practical, you will understand very quickly that this, in most of the cases, it is not best criteria. But you have to integrate one way or another the constraints of the total of financial resources available, and you have to integrate also the difficulties in calculations and data, the bias in the calculations, and the difficulties also to use some formulas like the formulas of internal rate of return. So we have here, you know, in this slide, and before moving to some others, we have a few basic questions, you know, on the investment decision. The investment decision is very often reduced to a calculation of NPV. We understand that the calculations should not be the first step, but we need to have a kind of creativity, innovative step before moving to any kind of data collection and calculation. We understand why, in a way, we have to study investment decision before any other element of a financial plan. You just have a look to my graph, my figure, architecture, and you will understand. Okay. And after that, we have a discussion here on the payback periods, you know, on the quality of NPV to measure the fact it's a good or not a good investment. And I gave you some examples with my Japanese stories here, or the integration of the criteria we have today in terms of quality of integration of new dimensions like health, for example. Okay. And also now, if we go back to the real world, we understand that on a practical basis, it's much more useful to have the first barrier, which is a payback period, And the second criteria, which is a profitability index. And we have to go through all these elements to try to find a portfolio investment which will be integrated into the financial plan. So it is not to say what was taught in the investment decision is not important. It is important. But you have to integrate that in a larger kind of analysis, diagnosis of a firm structure, of a strategy, before going into the calculations. Okay, for these first points. So now we have a few other elements here, which have to be also integrated, which are number 8, 9. Before moving after that, to some other points. So if you, if I just want to summarize this, two main elements. When you go on a diagnosis and financial plan, as always look to the investment plan. And if you go back to biotechnology, you will understand that this is a growing company with a 5-year investment plan, which is about 3 times in terms of amounts that the total equity of the firm, and which is very concentrated on the 2 first years for about 2/3 of the portfolio of investment. And that means that this firm with limited debt capacity, which is only 6,000, will have to go through scenarios, different scenarios, innovative scenarios to finance this program. The second point is that we should have doubts, question marks on the process. How this process of allocation of resources was organized. Only taking into account the short-term growth, even if it is high growth of the market for the products of this company, or taking into account also, long-term criteria or new measures which have to be introduced into analysis, like health, governance, for example. The third point is that we have to be very careful in the analysis of the criteria used in the calculations on the NPV, or something different with a kind of double step process. The cash repayments period, which is a payback period or payoff period, we know how to calculate that. And when did we integrate the constraint of the financial resources? It means not only the NPV, but the NPV per monetary unit. It means the profitability index. And what did you do? What did we do with the result? It is a percentage of productivity. What about the comparison with inflation? What the comparison with the interest rate? What the comparison with other alternative projects? So we have here many questions to go through and to understand and to integrate into a diagnosis and financial plan. This is what I wanted to show you right now. So I am here. Yeah, I was here. Slide number 7. It's time for a break. We've just a 10-minute break, and we'll come back with the following slides in the minutes to come, which are still on the investment decision process, 8 and 9, 10 also, and 11. 7, we move to some different dimensions. So we have finished with 1 to 7, and also some of the slides in the other set of slides. Now we have a break, and we start again with slide number 8 in a few minutes. Thank you. 10 minutes, no more. Okay, so I think we can start again, perhaps, have a short break, but have our topics to go through. So I was on that slide, the last slide I went through was number 7. I'm here with number 8 and trying to find with you some kind of rules or good practice, when you go through an investment plan, try to draw, to design an investment plan. So first point here, we need sensitivity analysis. We need sensitivity analysis, at least on the cash flow calculations, but perhaps also on some other elements like the terminal value calculations, like also the discount rate. And we'll see that into detail in valuation processes with the sensitivity of the growth rate, long-term growth rate of the cash flow of the dividends, and long-term the sensitivity of the weighted average cost of capital due to a different mix of financial resources. So sensitivity analysis is very central to make decisions very often. Second, we need, as we already said, for NPV and API calculation, discount rates discussion, and various. That means before making the calculation of an NPV or a PI, we need the first barrier, which is a liquidity barrier, which is the payback or payoff. And then we need also for the calculated element, which is difficult with NPV, easier with PI, a barrier, which is the minimum the return we want, which is generally, depending on the situation, either the inflation or the interest rate or what you call opportunity cost. That means the return you can obtain for another equivalent project with the same risk. Third part is, do we need, which is a much more difficult question, an impact on the investment portfolio and the choices. Do we need only one weighted average cost of capital for a company? So it is relatively clear when you have a conglomerate, and you have many conglomerates in Vietnam, family-owned or state-owned, have many conglomerates. Company which is at the same time in textile, in trading, and which has some kind of interest in the mechanical sector. Could we use the same work in the different segments of the company? It can be subsidiaries, it can be departments, divisions, it doesn't matter. Or do we have to integrate specific risks which are due to the operations themselves? Risk on operations is not the same in textile, in trading, in the mechanical sector. And the answer is that we have to integrate this level of risk one way or another. That means also, we have to calculate risk premium, which should be integrated into WACC. Operational risk premium at least. Okay, so this is another question we have to discuss about that later, but we have to keep that in mind. In many cases, we cannot use only the same one WACC for all the activities of a company which is relatively diversified, portfolio of activities. We can give the example of a company ladies know generally very well, which is LVMH, with Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy, with bags, perfumes, champagne, cognac. Can we use the same weighted average cost capital? Is the risk the same on these different activities? It's clear that the risk is not the same on the different activities. We know that we have market risk, depending on the evolution of the many customers, market customers, like China, for example. The risk is not the same on the bags, the perfumes, and the champagne. We know also that on the champagne there is a production risk, climate risk. This year will not be very good, for example, in champagne production in France. Because of the temperature in the spring, so how to introduce into the calculation this production risk, which would mean less volumes available, but at the same time higher costs of production and lower sales level. We have the same problem with Stellantis. Stellantis is a new group resulting of the association and merger of Daimler, Peugeot, and Fiat. And the characteristics of the group are very different, don't produce exactly the same kind of cars, in terms of luxury level, in terms of quality of the mechanic, the engines, in terms of progressive integration of hybrid cars. So it seems to be clear that the market risk is not the same. Risk on the operation and future investments is not the same too. We know that generally, luxury cars have a market which is more stable than the medium range cars. So that should be taken into account in the WACC. So WACC is always difficult, to calculate. You will see in finance that we have another way to calculate a WACC, which is to say, at the end, what is the cost of debt? Cost of debt should be equal to the risk-free rate plus premiums, an operational premium, which is due to the business model in the economic sector, and a risk premium, which is connected to the structure of the right side of the balance sheet. It means liquidity, solvency, and leverage. So you can have a calculation that way for the cost, the average cost of debt, and you take that into account, the data into account with the cost of equity to calculate the WACC. So anyway, it seems that the business risk is one issue of the calculation of the WACC, and that it is difficult to have only one WACC in a diversified group in conglomerates. Another question is on the values to take into account into the calculation. We have a good case of that in the company evaluation course. What to do with that? Do we have to make the calculations in book value? If in the valuation you find in the balance sheet, okay. Or do we have to integrate some kind of market values? And this is a discussion which is kind of infinite discussion, but you understand that depending on the formulas, we have different values. We have to be very careful to this point. And when you go into details and raise a question to CFOs, the answer at the end is that we are better to use market values than book values, but they are more real world values. They are not, regulated values. So when we have done all this, we've identified the potential investment, taking into account innovation, creativity, selected the investment using the first barrier on solvency, liquidity, and second one, general profitability index, making the comparison references, made some sensitivity analysis, used to make the calculations, the WACC adapted to these different business model included into the investment, taking into account market values, which are better than book values. We have a portfolio of investment which has been selected. It is a reduced portfolio because many potential investments have been eliminated into the different steps of the analysis. But we have done some progress in this process. But now when you have a portfolio which has been reduced according to all these dimensions, we have generally two elements to take into account. We have a priority order, and this is very important for our financial plan. What is the priority? What is the first investment to finance? We have chosen 10 investments for years to come. Is there any priority? What is the first one to finance? And very often, the idea here is that you have needs to develop an investment project in terms of strategy. Some kind, you have a competitor, he is using the same, he is developing very quickly another comparable investment, and it will be on the market before you, so you have to accelerate. So competition is very often one of the elements to take into account. The second one could be the human resources investments are more and more complex, and you need to have teams with expertise, engineers, managers, and so on. Sometimes you don't have it immediately, so there's a priority order. And third, it could be financial resources. In your portfolio, you have investment which need a large amount of cash, some others with low amount of cash, and you don't have, for example, immediately the necessary funds to finance the largest investment. So there's management, there's strategy, and there's a financial availability priority. And on the timing also, you can have two different influences and completely different, which are first authorization. For some kind of investments, to develop them, you need authorization. You want to develop today a new production of energy, a new kind of plant. Even if it is not nuclear, it could be a wind machine. You need some kind of authorization of the authorities, of the buyer, and so on to develop that. And it can take time to get the authorization. And in some other projects, you need some more research, applied research. You know that it will be successful. You understand, exactly, your engineers understand what to do, but there are a few more steps to go through before developing the project. So you get priority orders. You have problem of timing, which are to be taken into account when you integrate the investment you have selected in your portfolio into the investment plan and the financial plan. Okay, and this is also very important. So be very careful, because the portfolio of project is now selected. But in fact, we have to adjust, the resources, financial resources, and the timing of the development of investment portfolios. We have to be careful that it fits together. Point 3, we have different categories of projects, and this is very clear in the biotechnology case. If you get the case and you already know the case, if you go to the biotechnology case and have a look to the investment plan, and the investment plan is page 4 of the case, you will find very different categories of investments. But I don't talk now about economic sector, but have a look to the investment in terms of financial resources availability. You have here in this biotechnology investment plan, very classical investments, which are investment in construction, building, warehouses, plants, that's very classical and can be generally financed easily. You can finance them, of course, using your free cash flow. You can finance them in equity issues, as cash to shareholders. You can finance them by debt, either bonds issued to the market, or classically loans from the banks. And you can use any kind of more sophisticated products like leasing, or like convertible bonds. So financial resources used are very flexible for that kind of project. It is the case also for what we call classical equipment. And here you have it's line 4 of a table of a plan. You have an equipment for existing manufacturing unit. We are in the case of renewal of investment, modernization, if you like. We invested a few years ago. Now the equipment is completely depreciated. Book value is for €1 or $1, and we have the necessary resources, need necessary resources to have a new equipment, same kind of equipment, but the new model, more modern, more productive, more efficient, whatever you want, And this generally can be done easily also like the construction investment with equity, free cash flows, any kind of debt, and leasing contracts. So we have a large flexibility on how to finance them. Now, if you have a look, to equipment for a new production unit, it depends what is a new production unit. Because the risk of a lender is not the same, if it is a unit which is completely unknown, completely new process, we're not so sure it will be successful or not. So that means that generally when we have a new production unit, you need more equity, percentage of equity, than when it is just, to have a new version of the old equipment you have been running for the last 10 years. And this has an impact on your financial mix. And you have a case of the equipment satellite for the research center. And the equipment for research center, is very often something very specific. There is no other case. There is no secondary market, So you need a large percentage of equity, free cash flow, or new equity issues to finance the project. And also, you have, and this is not the case really here, but you have in many industries, I was talking about the food industry, good case, luxury products, good case also, good example. You have investment in brands. You acquire brands for your competitors or from another company in a way, and you have to pay for that, And it will be very difficult for a brand to get a loan for a bank or to be able to launch, to ask for new bonds on the market, So brands, and intangibles in general should be mainly financed by equity or by the free cash flow of the firms. It means, when you are running a firm, which is in economic sectors with high research level, with high level of, let's say, brands in their total sets. This kind of company need large amount of equity, or if they don't have a large amount of equity available, they need to produce high level of free cash flows. And this is one of the issue today, because the industry of the future is more and more oriented towards firms with high research level, investment level, and also with products, with brands which are valued at high level. And this cannot be financed easily through debts or leasing. You need equity, either equity bought by a shareholder, or retained earnings, or free cash flows. Okay, so this is a constraint on the growing firm, and this is what we find also in the biotechnology case. So you understand the sentence here: research projects, grants, acquisitions, and real estate or equipment projects are not submitted to the same constraint. It's much easier to finance a real estate project or a classical equipment project than a research project or a brand acquisition. That means the traditional industries or activities are a kind of advantage compared to the new industries in terms of financial techniques, and this has to be taken into account in the financial plan. The last point here, the last point is that that capacity can be extended using leasing contracts. We will make calculations on that. Please. But this means clearly that at least part of the leasing contracts are debts. On the financial point of view, they are debts contracts. Of course, there is a legal environment which is a bit different. But anyway, they are very, very close to a debt contract. And this is what we will find when we make the distinction between the financial leasing and the operational leasing contracts. And it is clear that in some kind of industry where we have a large percentage of equipment, let's see, for example, to the transportation activities with lorries, they use large percentage of leasing contracts. But in fact, when you have a look to the financial characteristic of these contracts, they are very, very close to classical debt contracts. And in financial terms, it should be analyzed as debt contracts. It means if you can obtain more cash to finance your lorries through leasing contract than through classical debt contract, that means you have an extension of a debt capacity using leasing contracts. And this is more and more true in many parts of the world for real estate investment, which are more and more financed also by leasing contract for an extension of a level of debt which is accepted. You understand that behind this, there's a question of options and a question of guarantees, and we'll come back later on these different points. So be careful. We have been through different steps before, but here on that slide we introduced the problem of the priority order, of the timing of the projects, of the financial characteristics of the process, the project, which introduce constraints again on the fact you can use equity, debt, or you can use any kind of financial resources. And we raise the question of the extension of that capacity using partly leasing contracts at least. And this is one way to facilitate, to get flexibility of the financial resources and the financial mix to use to finance investments. Here, I've got slide number 10, slide number 10 with other issues, I'll be said a few words on for some of them. You have a problem of the long-term horizon, risky project. Long-term horizon, we said a few words on that with a Japanese example with the food industry. A risky project, but which is very often also long-term project. You have a case of petroleum companies, petroleum industry. It means when you dig in the sea, you're trying to find oil, you don't know what it will happen. It's some kind of binary result. Either you get it or you don't get it. So it's very difficult to use the classical criteria in these cases, and we have to find other ways to deal with these projects, which are not generally integrated with chapters on investment decision. And I will say a few words in a few minutes. It is the same problem we find in the pharmaceutical sector and biotechnology companies. When you are looking for vaccines, for against the pandemic today, either you find it or you don't find it, or you find the vaccine, but the efficiency of the vaccine is only on 40% of the persons, and for 60% is no use. Or you find a vaccine which is efficient for 95% of the persons. And this is the difference between the different vaccines we find right now on the market, And of course, it means either there is a market investment because it's a very good product, or there is no market because if it is efficient in one case out of two, you don't need a vaccine to do that. So risky projects should be analyzed in specific ways. So point 2 here, we know that NPV is often negative and produce very late, as my companies, and that risk level is high and difficult to forecast in long-term project also. And we have to find other models than NPV. So we have approaches and models which are based on other elements, other approaches, which are mainly option. We have option pricing, calls, and we have option models, and they are very often used in the petroleum industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, to find a value to a project. So we have to integrate that also in our diagnosis and in our financial plan. So this is the conclusion is that we have limits to the classical NPV models. That means through some of them, and this is what I wanted to underline here. Now, what I want to do with you is to go through some questions of the past exams. So I hope I will succeed in doing that. I go back here to the other set of slides. So I hope you see my slides. Yeah, I am here. I moved from the 93 slide to the FA2 and the F18, FA2 slide. Is that correct? Let's try again. Nouveau partage. That's clear. Should be there. And I'm on slide number 3. Yeah. Slide number 3. And slide number 3 is on the one of the preceding exam. I hope you see that, which is June 2019. And on this June 2019 exam, you find different questions. And perhaps the first question I want to go through with you is a question which is part 1, 2, June 19, part 1, 2, and slide number 3. And the question is, I read the question, what are the different steps of an investment decision process? You will identify the qualitative and quantitative steps and show their specific value to the quality of the process. This is just in fact what I did. I'm trying to show you. It is first, I want to simplify here the structure of the answer. We have a first step, which is a non-quantitative step, making an analysis of an identification of the potential investment, not only on a modernization issue, but also taking into account all the innovation dimensions, all the creativity position or potential position. So this is more a list than investment than any kind of valuation of investment. Second, we should be clear in terms of calculations on the liquidity solvency approach, which means in terms of payback or payoff and other barrier, which has to be found according to the characteristic of the economic sector. The food industry is not the steel industry. Third, we can go through quantitative analysis. But in most of the cases, we are more interested by the return per monetary unit than the absolute return. That means it's a category of NPV. Introduction, we're taking into account the amount of financial resources needed, which is a profitability index. 4, the results obtained should be compared to some kind of benchmarks or rules. It means a 15%, what I said, doesn't have any meaning by itself, but it should be compared to some kind of benchmark of reference. Of course, inflation, of course, interest rate, of course, the return of comparable project with the same level of risk, what we call the same class of risk projects. And of course, the number of 10, percentage of 10 is higher than the reference, it's okay, it's a good project. If not, it's not number one, at least in the ranking. Okay. After that, the next point, we have to be very careful on the priority orders, because some other elements have to be taken into account. The availability of human resources, the availability of administrative authorization, for example, which can be important in that kind of the project which is analyzed. Okay. So after that, we will be able to make a list of the projects, a list of priorities, and to start thinking about the financial resources to use. And what we will understand is that, of course, we have two main questions there. The first one being the impact of the two main elements of the work on the value of the work and the profitability index, which means the higher the percentage of total equity you have, the higher is the work and the lower the profitability of investment. And of course, if you have a high level of debt, you have a lower work and lower work, higher profitability. That's what you find. The second point is that you have to analyze investment one by one. Some investments are eligible into any kind of financial resources, traditional equipment, modernization of equipment, but some others, are not eligible even to leasing contracts. For example, you acquire a brand from another firm, you have to find equity to finance that. You are developing investment in new research on very specific, disease, you are in pharmaceutical sector, you need equity to finance this. You will not find a loan from the bank or even bonds issue or leasing. So there is a kind of connection, a link and constraint which is brought, by the kind of investment you finance in the search for financial resources, and at the end, to the cost of these resources, to the WACC, and to the profitability of a portfolio. So this is what I wanted you to understand. And last, for some investments, which are very long-term investments, or very risky investments, I have my story on Japanese food industry, the dairy products and development industry, have the petroleum industry, for example, or pharmaceutical industry for some research. You have to find some other approaches, and this is generally based on what we call real options, from model of options, calls if you prefer, and we'll study that later. So this is what you can say on this first question, which is a very, very important questions. So my second question today is that it's on July 20, which is the next exam. It is this one, I think, yeah. Next, July 20, slide number 6 of a set of slides here. Yeah. We have a first question and a second question which are of interest for us here. Part 1, question 2 first, which is more simple. Okay. The question is the following: is the operating working capital taken into account in the investment return calculations? Net present value, internal rate of return. Explain and discuss. And you know here that the answer is very simple. It's much more simple than the preceding question and the next one. Yeah. The answer is clearly yes. If you buy an equipment to produce chocolate, for example, and you want to sell that chocolate, you have several steps in the process. That means at the end of the production day, you have a look at what's happened in your plant. You understand that you have a raw material inventory, that you have some kind of intermediate products inventory, and you have also final inventory. So this is due to investment. If you want the equipment you have bought, the investment itself, is working properly, you need these inventories. And if this in this economic sector in your country, the tradition is to give 30 days credit to customers. If you want to stay on the market and to be competitive, you need to give also a credit. So this will be an element, of course, of your investment. And on the other side, to finance this, perhaps you will get some kind of credit coming from the providers, from the tax administration, and from the staff. You have to take into account these elements, these differences. Okay? So the operating working capital is one element of the investment itself. And you have to think about its level, you have to integrate it into the calculations, and you have to think about on how it is financed. Is it financed by its own element? It's close to zero. Is it negative? Is it a resource? Or is it positive? And in that case, it has to be financed either by the net working capital, the excess of long-term resources, and the level of the investment included into the balance sheet. It means on the equipment mainly, or is it financed also partly by the short-term debt coming from the banks? Okay, so this is okay. So the answer is clearly yes. It is part of the investment. It has to be included into the calculation for very clear reason. It has to be, and the question is how is it financed? By the upper part of the balance sheet or the lower part of the balance sheet. Generally, it's by both of them. But what is the percentages? What are the percentages involved? So this is taken into account. And of course, the last point could be we understand immediately why CFOs are running programs of reduction of the operating working capital, just because it has an influence on the return. If you reduce your operating working capital, maybe closer to zero, that means you need less resources, and at the same time, the level of the investment you compare to the future cash flows is lower, and profitability is higher. So this is question 2 here. Perhaps last question here for today. It is part 1, question 1, same exam. According to the separation theorem, the investment and the financial decisions are separated. Thus, this theoretical approach is applicable to real-life cases. So, if you remember what we did, but I will come back on some that point in financial analysis, the modern finance theory consider that a balance sheet, is made of really 2 different parts. On one side, you have the assets, and you try to find the return on the assets. On the other side, you get the equity and the liabilities, and you try to calculate, the total cost, and the total cost is what? It is a return on average cost of capital. And you hope, of course, that the return of the portfolio of assets on the left side is higher than the cost of the right side, which is the return on average cost of capital. Okay, so well, that's how it is presented in Berkeley-DeMarzo. Okay? And the question is it applicable to real life, or is it applicable to all the cases you find in the real life? And the answer is probably no. It's applicable in some cases, but not in some others. And you understand here that, of course, the asset side has an impact on the right side. If in my investment, which is the case of Danone or Nestlé, this food, large international food industry, the percentage of brand in the total level of assets is very, very important. Not so far from 40% or 50%. That means they have to be financed by equity. That means, in that kind of company, the level of equity is very high. It's not really a choice; it's compulsory. There's no other way to do that. So there is a relation between the right and the left side. They cannot be completely separated because of the nature of the investments of the left side. When you have a building financed by a leasing contract, they are completely connected. It is a leasing contract is a debt, but it is a debt which is not the debt of a firm as a whole. It is a debt which is based on the building. So there is a connection. So you can find many exceptions. That means, both analyses are true and are useful. At the same time, you need that the return on assets should be higher than the WACC. Because if you are not in the situation in the long run, you lose, you will have losses, recurrent losses. But at the same time, at least part of the assets, severe assets, are connected to financial resources. And these two dimensions have to be taken into account into the analysis. So the financial theory present a simplified, organization of investment structure, investment selection, and on the financial resources choices, which is useful, but we have exceptions to integrate into this analysis. This is what's really happened. So what I wanted to do is to give you some examples, of a few questions, and we do that in each session, we give you the main arguments to answer to 3 or 4 questions each time, in order you are ready in your preparation to a final exam, and at the same time you understand better some key questions, some key problems we find in this diagnosis and financial policy forecast and design. That's what I wanted to do. So what I'm trying to do today, it's first to present the course, the syllabus, and so on. It was second, to introduce the architecture, and we went through the architecture here. This is from the architecture. Okay. We have a look to financial references, and not only the classical one, but also more chapters of Burke and DiMarzo, who spent time on the investment decision after presenting, the connection between the investment decision, the other elements of the diagnosis and the financial decision through the architecture. We try to apply this to biotechnology, and we come back later to biotechnology. We tried also to define the process of selection with different steps, integrating, this innovation step, which introduce new processes, new down top and bottom processes, leave some kind of freedom to everyone to make proposals before moving to evaluation process. Make a distinction, clear distinction between the solvency, liquidity, and the written elements. Said a few words on the barriers. Said a few words on the relative importance of NPV and profitability index in the real life. The problem raised also by some kind of investment decision, long-term, risky decision. The elements to take into account: don't forget the operating working capital, don't forget the grant, don't forget research, and be clear that all these investments, which are more and more important in every business life, can be financed like building, like classical production equipment, but any kind of financial resources. This is what I wanted to show you. And we had a few words on the separation theorem and its application, which is could be very useful also for our next session. So we are just at the end of the process and the presentation for today, and We will again tomorrow move to other slides, and to step 2 of the presentation, which has been presented at the beginning of this session. So thank you very much. I hope you will sleep well after 3 hours of finance and before another session tomorrow. And anyway, take care, and I hope again to see you soon in Vietnam. Bye. No question? Goodbye. Sleep well.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you, Professor. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thank you.